Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Emily Blanck's Galveston on San Francisco Bay, Juneteenth in the Fillmore District, 1945 to 2016. What I like about this article is that it's basically discussing how um, fluid a celebration can be. A calendar custom, any item of folklore, but we're talking particularly about customs here, are basically assemblies of symbols. They need to be resonant symbols. They're typically attached to some kind of narrative, and that narrative has to be important. It doesn't necessarily have to be active, but it has to have some form of importance. Um, and then, but once we have this system, once we have this group of symbols, they can be adapted elsewhere to people with analogous or similar stories or for various purposes. They can be done solemnly, they can be done joyfully, they can just be moved. So we have this thing called Juneteenth, which commemorates the day, June 19th, 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was finally read to a group of enslaved persons in Texas, and they recognized for the first time that they were free, that slavery had been abolished as a system. This was 2 years after the proclamation had been passed. This was after the death of Lincoln, and it required basically the Union. It required the representatives of the no longer called that, but basically, the North, to enforce, to be the powers that were actually able to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. But basically, it marked it marked the functional end of slavery as an institution in the states. Arguably, it didn't, but it's certainly a moment in time. And what's important is that the people in Texas saw this day as critical, and then when the next year, when 1866, June 19th came around, they commemorated that day. They commemorated the day as something that was important and vital to this community. And they did so, of course, they were all formerly enslaved peoples. And they had greater freedoms, greater liberties than before. And they continued to celebrate every year this thing. It swept across much of Texas. And it was done in different ways in different places, but it basically became a Texas African American holiday about this time. And holiday, of course, is something that we should um, just take a second to parse. It was a day that was by the very name was marked on the calendars as being a critical anniversary of a foundational moment, and so whether or not it has a holiday aspect to it in terms of cheeriness, although clearly this was a celebration of an emancipation, so there was a joy. It was typically associated with it. The solemnity that might occur in terms of there was the preachers would give sermons, and there was an attitude of lest we forget, we should remember what happened before. Our times are good now. Let's not forget the times were not always so. We can be joyful, and yet that isn't a matter for it. This isn't the time for naivete, particularly. Um, but whether it is marked by the state, whether it is given some kind of official sanction or status, we can use this word holiday in a number of ways. And it's in a way similar to how Jack Santino talks about holidays. It's just they are marked marked occasions. It's tied into the story, the very real history um, the institution of slavery, of legalized slavery in the United States, and the mechanisms that sought to end it. And more importantly, the people whose lives were fundamentally changed because they were finally granted status by the state, something that was already bestowed upon them by their creator, if we take the founding documents of the United States seriously. It's like finally you are part of this definition of man. So cool. And it was a long-standing Texas celebration. And then you had, whether you want to call him an entrepreneur or whether you want to call him a celebrant, you had this guy called Wesley Johnson, who brought Juneteenth to San Francisco. So San Francisco had clearly been an important city for a number of years. Foundational in terms of the gold rush in 1849, but a naval base and a port of a place of industry, but through a number of reasons, did not have a significant African American community until the middle of the 20th century. Basically, those reasons were, even though it didn't have the same instrumental issues of redlining and instrumental structural racism that other places may have had in terms of the city itself, it didn't encourage much in the way of migration, largely because most of the jobs that were there were union jobs, and the unions excluded African Americans from joining. So what work there was in the traditional economies of people who have been given some kind of marginal status in terms of service work, domestic work, and so on. So the population wasn't particularly significant. Then there was this large movement at the outbreak of the American involvement in the Second World War, because shipbuilding and munitions, and these were federal institutions, and or at least had federal contracts, and they attracted people who were working, who were seeking jobs that was not going to be restricted by race. They did not have to be subject to the insidious racial limitations of the union contracts. So the black population boomed at this time in the early 1940s. And Wesley Johnson had been there already for a couple of years, and had started a couple of nightclubs, because why not? This was also the end of the jazz era, and he was a small businessman, and he decided to have these events at his establishment, Juneteenth. And so they'd often be for a couple of days, and there was music and jazz music and drinks and so on. It was a nightclub event, and it became an important part of the social calendar, an important part of the African American leisure life, and marked the calendar. And many of these people, the vast majority of this population, were actually from Texas. There's a huge migration in as much as the Great Migration that's spoken about in the 30s and 40s of African Americans from the South, which is where they were largely congregating at that time, to north to Chicago, west to California, northeast to New York, and so on. That large migration was, fundamentally changed American culture. It also changed, specifically, we're talking San Francisco culture. And so, you have this beginnings of, you might not want to call them necessarily the affluent middle class, but you had the beginnings of a much more urbanized African American population in San Francisco that began to have a sense of cohesion. There were community newspapers before, there were organizations before. This is not to diminish the population, but in size, it was smaller when compared to other migrant populations or other non-white populations in San Francisco and other African American communities in other cities. So it was a small group. So he has this celebration, and people recognized it because so many of them came from Texas. And meanwhile, in Texas, Juneteenth had sort of fallen back in large part because Juneteenth was, as it was a day to remember formerly enslaved peoples, as in the 75-year stretch between when between the announcement in 1865 and the start of the Second World War. Those people had passed away. So what happens when a ceremony that is about a particular cohort, as it were, ends? What is the purpose of it if it is about really commemorating these living people? So in many places in Texas, it had basically stopped because there were no more living former enslaved peoples. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, this became kind of a play activity. This is not the church picnic. This is not the family occasion that was happening in Texas. This was not like a daytime familial community thing. This was a nighttime sophisticated evening thing. It was still fundamentally black, as it were. It was about participating in black culture in a black way, but it was through leisure, and it was through entertainment, and it was through joy. Um, and then, a couple of years later, you have in the rise of a couple of things. So the African American community was largely congregated in the Fillmore neighborhood, Fillmore Street, in the West Addition section of San Francisco. And that one of the interesting aspects of that is that that neighborhood had historically had a large number of Japanese immigrants. And when the policies for Japanese internment came at the beginning of the Second World War, that neighborhood that had previously been largely Japanese was fundamentally emptied out by military force. And so the black community was able to find cheap rents at that place. So they had already been sort of there, and then this became the black neighborhood. And that's the neighborhood that Wesley Johnson had his clubs in. And so this was a neighborhood that had already been primarily one group of migrants, the Japanese. Then it became another group of migrants, the African American Great Migration, and predominantly Texan African Americans. And it fell into that system of these were already often consequences, because with this influx of population, there was also new, seemingly temporary housing built in these neighborhoods as well. And basically, these became the neighborhoods that were targeted during the ostensibly positive campaign by the federal government of improving the inner cities. But improving the inner cities in terms of infrastructure typically means looking at the people who are already racially disadvantaged by living in these areas. They are these areas have fallen into disrepair largely through certain forms of official neglect. Through that official neglect, then it does start to attract things like higher rates of crime and so on, at which point they can be officially targeted as problem areas, and forcible evictions can take place, buildings can be razed, even if the idea is that these buildings are going to be replaced with contemporary housing. For the most part, the original residents never get back into their neighborhoods. So neighborhoods are sort of fundamentally destroyed. You also had, in the mid-1960s, you had the rise of the American Civil Rights Movement, and you had the rise of the Black Power movement, sort of coincidental. Civil rights movement starting mid-50s and going into the late 60s. The Black Power movement starting perhaps more likely in the mid-60s, where, I mean, obviously they are similar in cause, but one is about basically trying to attain and establish the right to have the same rights as white America. And the Black Power movement was more about sort of equivalency and equitability. It's that we don't necessarily want to repeat the patterns of white culture. We are as worthy of whites as options in terms of freedoms of assembly and so on, but there is a black culture, so we do not want to. This is grossly misrepresenting what the civil rights movement was about, but I think within the language of the Black Power movement, it largely had to do with the issue of we don't want a seat at this table because this table erases what is wonderful about blackness. It's all well and good, that fight is good, but we have our own culture, we have our own thing, and we wish to work within that. So that's also where you have the development of a black aesthetic in terms of moving away from, you remember the civil rights campaign is often people were wearing the same kind of clothes, the same kind of suits, the suit that denoted white respectability and suggested that the participants were equivalent and capable of of the respectability that is imposed upon whites. Meanwhile, Black Power movement was a lot more about African design, African dance, and so on, and something that we don't need to use your language. So all of this was in flux. San Francisco, despite the fact that it was also the hotbed of things like the hippies and the hotbed of much of sort of the counterculture and the hotbed of certainly LGBTQ America, the black neighborhood was in this realm of respectability politics. And so the Juneteenth celebration, which was always a joyous and never, I mean, it might be associated with nightclubs and music, but it wasn't a raucous or profane event. It became a parade. And it became a parade that marked space. And one of the things that we want to remember in terms of public displays in calendar customs, we can go back to things like the St. Patrick's Day Parade, we can go to things like the Gay Pride Parade, we can go to many of these events that are now perhaps nationally recognized. Many of them have this emergence in the North American context of reaffirming place in the public sphere. And that it's the sort of almost defiant parades of Irishness, of LGBTQ, of blackness, and so they. But within that defiance doesn't necessarily need to be done in a defiant way. It can be done through this issue of respectability. It is so basically this sort of two-pronged message. This is a black space, but this black space is welcoming. This black space is non-threatening. This black space is kind. This black space is no different in many aspects from other spaces in this city, and is welcome to all, but let it be known that this is a black space and the black community should be respected. So as the neighborhood was going through these, sometimes deliberate destruction due to municipal politics, simultaneously the community was being elevated. Then it went through this third phase where, in large part, in trying to court the black vote, and in many ways also perhaps trying to atone for the sins of the past, this community celebration became basically recognized by the city and became elevated in status to one of the many things that makes San Francisco a place and makes San Francisco a community of communities, and all that positive, but also perhaps with a certain amount of, what's the word I'm looking for? A certain amount of ulterior motive. The government, the state, the mayoralty. That's the word I'm looking for. The city, the municipality, granted room and granted action to Juneteenth to be part of the calendar of events, and so it was modeled very similar to how the Chinese New Year celebrations were, where this is about one of our communities, but this is also a city event. It's one of the things that makes San Francisco, are these chains of events. So it was still very much about blackness, but it was simultaneously sanctioned, and it was sort of like a tile in the mosaic, but we are in control of the mosaic. Now, in the past couple of years, the city has drawn back from it, in part because certainly through like the Silicon Valley boom, San Francisco is now just too expensive a city. And most of that population, most of that African-American population, has simply been squeezed out. And so the population is on the decline. Certainly that many of the neighborhoods, and it isn't simply in San Francisco, but it's particularly endemic in San Francisco, have gone through these processes of gentrification, where these old neighborhoods can become reclaimed. Developers will just skyrocket prices, because it's what happens with immigrant communities. They, by virtue of their economic circumstances, they are more renter communities than they are buyer communities, and renters don't have the same amount of rights. And so once a population leaves, there might be a certain amount of rights, but once a population leaves, they can't make sort of the moral claim, or once buildings are renovated, they don't have sort of claim to tenancy in the same way. So the population is now more or less decreased, and it's still celebrated, but not in the same kind of way. But it's fascinating in that Juneteenth simultaneously has taken on this national flavor to the point where, since publishing this article in 2021, it was basically officially marked as something on the calendar. And it's gone through this stage of, in terms of that respectability politics, it's gone through different waves. As I said, it stopped in Galveston, in part because it was about former slaves, and in part because of the civil rights movement itself. Sorry, Galveston, Texas, and so on. I'm just thinking back to the title of the article. But in part because of the civil rights, the progress of the civil rights movement itself, and that we are entitled to the things that white America has. And so, as a midsummer festival, July the 4th, which hadn't necessarily been big in the African American community, became something that was embraced. Subsequently, in the past couple of years, especially when it's like, when I would hesitate to say whether the Black Power movement is the same as it was in the 60s and 70s, but certainly this recognition of African American consciousness and this reestablishment of African American forms, there's been a rejection of the 4th of July. There's been a rejection of that as a midsummer holiday, and Juneteenth has been rediscovered. This is, of course, in the year and a half since the death of George Floyd, since the Black Lives Matter, the rebirth of the resparking of Black Lives Matter in the months subsequent, and post the election of Biden, and particularly Kamala Harris, who is of this San Francisco African American community to begin with, and she got her start in city politics in San Francisco. So it's a wonderful reading, and the history of it is great, and the history of it we need to be reminded of, that these things can go from community festivals. These things can start as without any disrespect to Wesley Johnson, these can start as slightly mercenary, hey, remember this thing we used to do? Come to my nightclub and we'll do it again. And yet take on fundamental meaning. And it takes on a meaning that might have a slippery connection, even like the official histories. Well, official histories in as much as when a newspaper explains to the larger audience what this particular group's history festival is about. The actual origins are about, it commemorates the end of slavery and sort of obfuscates that is about the announcement and actually the delayed release from the processes of slavery. It talks about it in terms of it being Southern because there's a certain default association of Black consciousness with the South and the Southern states, as opposed to Texas, which is kind of on the periphery of what we understood when we typically understand the Southern states. So this isn't an Alabama thing. But we kind of get sort of shunted in that direction. It isn't a Tennessee thing, but we will sort of play with that for a while. But it's a fascinating read because it is about how we can find meanings that are sincere, we can find meanings that are potentially cynical, but they're associated with stories. There's only so much that people outside of the originating community can make claim to Juneteenth. That this is, because of its foundational story, this is an African American celebration. And it doesn't mean that there is a uniformity in how it is celebrated. It doesn't mean that it is de facto exclusionary, but it does mean that in order to recognize the day, you are at least adverting to a part and a critical moment, however that's reported. Whether it's about the end of slavery or the actual sort of Juneteenth origin, a critical moment in African American history. And so by granting it this status, now, this federal status, by recognizing that this is an important date on the calendars, whether or not it becomes a day off, which is a thing to consider about how much we weigh our various days, But as it progresses, it becomes this is a time when we collectively recognize this particular moment, this particular story, our shared participation in this story, whether as the descendants of formerly enslaved peoples or the descendants of former enslavers or the people who benefited from that. It marks an occasion, but that doesn't mean that it can't be joyous. It doesn't mean that there can't be, Kool-Aid and ice cream and barbecue and a dance in the evening. It doesn't mean that there can't be cocktails at night. Doesn't mean that there can't be music. It's just of we have created from history a forest of symbols that we are through which we are reminding ourselves of this history. And we do so by gathering together in some kind of joyous abandon. Boom! I nailed the ending. You didn't think I would, but I did. So anyway, it's a great article. And I looked up, Emily Blanck is not a folklorist, more's the pity, but this is part of a larger work that she's compiling on Juneteenth and the various manifestations of it. And so that will be an interesting book when it finally comes out in a couple of years. But until that time, you have this to go on, and this is Emily Blanck's Galveston on San Francisco Bay, Juneteenth in the Fillmore District, 1945 to 2016. I'm Ian. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.